Hey Vikings fans! Something's definitely cooking behind the scenes right now. You can just feel it, right? It's not one of those loud, flashy moments. It's more like the kind of move that makes you stop and think, wait, what are they setting up here? Because after what just happened, this team suddenly has options. And depending on how they play it, things could get really interesting going into the season. Let's analyze everything in detail. But first, click the like button and write in the comments, "Go Steelers!" Something quietly shifted inside the Minnesota Vikings organization right after the 2026 NFL Draft. And if you weren't paying close attention, you might have missed just how big this moment could be for the franchise moving forward. Because the headline isn't just about new rookies arriving, it's about what the team suddenly unlocked behind the scenes. The decision to move on from Jonathan Greenard during Day 2 of the draft didn't just reshape the defensive front. It cracked open financial flexibility that could now redefine the roster. We're talking about $34 million freed over the next 2 seasons, with roughly $12 million immediately available this year. And that changes everything about how the Vikings can approach the remaining free agent market. And here's where things start to get interesting. Because instead of making splashy moves early, the Vikings appear to be positioning themselves for calculated, strategic additions. The kind that don't dominate headlines at first, but end up deciding games in December. Let's start with a name that once terrified quarterbacks across the league, Marshon Lattimore. On paper, it sounds intriguing. A former All-Pro, elite pedigree out of Ohio State, and a corner who, at his peak, could erase top receivers. But reality tells a different story right now. Last season exposed a harsh truth: the physical decline that hits many corners reliant on athleticism. Injuries piled up, production dipped, and opposing quarterbacks found success attacking him, reflected in a high passer rating allowed despite recording 7 pass breakups and 1 interception. And when you look at Brian Flores' defensive philosophy, things get even more complicated. This system doesn't prioritize stacking depth at cornerback the way others do. The Vikings already seem comfortable with their core group, making it unlikely they'd invest in a 5th option, especially one with recent struggles. So while the name carries weight, this feels more like a long shot than a realistic move. But then, you shift your attention to the edge. And suddenly, the conversation changes. Because losing Jonathan Greenard doesn't just create cap space, it creates a void in identity. Over the past 2 seasons, Minnesota didn't need to chase veteran pass rushers. The trio of Andrew Van Ginkel, Dallas Turner, and Greenard gave them stability. That safety net? It's gone now. Enter Haason Reddick. This is where things get quietly dangerous for the rest of the league. Reddick may not be coming off his best season with Tampa Bay, and even his stint with the New York Jets raised questions. But rewind just a bit, back to his time in Philadelphia, and you're looking at a player who nearly combined for 30 sacks across 2 seasons. That kind of production doesn't just disappear, it evolves. And more importantly, it fits. Because the Vikings don't necessarily need Reddick to be the guy. They need him to be a weapon, a rotational pass rusher, a situational disruptor. Imagine 3rd and long, Flores dialing up pressure, and Reddick lining up opposite Dallas Turner, while Van Ginkel roams in that hybrid joker role. That's not just depth, that's chaos for opposing offenses. And if Minnesota truly wants to lean into that aggressive, unpredictable defensive identity, this type of move makes far more sense than chasing declining names at corner. But the Vikings might not stop there. There's another veteran quietly sitting on the market who knows this system inside and out: Kyle Van Noy. And this one feels different, because Van Noy isn't just productive, he's familiar. His time with Flores means there's no learning curve. No adjustment period. He steps in and immediately understands the complexity of the scheme, the timing of blitz packages, the discipline required in coverage. And here's the scary part. Pairing Van Noy with Van Ginkel would give Minnesota two highly intelligent, versatile defenders who can disguise intentions on every snap. Drop into coverage, attack the quarterback, shift pre-snap looks. This is exactly the kind of flexibility Flores thrives on. It's not about star power. It's about control. And right now, the Vikings are quietly building towards something that feels far more calculated than flashy. But the deeper you go into this list, the more you realize this isn't just about defense. There are contingency plans forming across the roster, including one that could signal the end of an era in Minnesota. Because if a certain veteran leader decides to walk away, the Vikings already know exactly who they might call. And that's where things start to take an unexpected turn. Before we get into that next move and the names that could reshape the offense, I want to hear from you. If you're running this front office right now, which free agent are you targeting first? Drop your pick in the comments, because the next part of this story might completely change your answer. And this is where the story starts to shift from interesting possibilities to decisions that could genuinely reshape the identity of this roster heading into the season. Because while the defensive side has clear flexibility, there's a looming question on the back end that nobody inside the building can ignore. What happens if Harrison Smith decides it's time? The possibility of retirement isn't just speculation. It's a scenario the Vikings are actively preparing for. And if that moment comes, Minnesota isn't going to panic. They already have a contingency name in mind: Jimmy Ward. Now, this wouldn't be a flashy signing. It wouldn't dominate headlines, but it would be calculated. Ward brings experience, leadership, and most importantly, familiarity with high-level defensive systems after his time with DeMeco Ryans in both San Francisco and Houston. This would be what you call a stability move. Someone who can step into a locker room, guide younger players, and keep the defense aligned if Smith walks away. And make no mistake, losing Harrison Smith wouldn't just be about production. It would be about losing one of the smartest defensive minds on the field. That's not easily replaced. So if Ward becomes that emergency option, it tells you everything about how seriously the Vikings are preparing for every possible outcome. But now, let's flip to the offensive side, because this is where things start to get really intriguing. There's a name that wasn't originally expected to even be part of this conversation. But suddenly, because of the extra cap space, he's right in the middle of it. Jauan Jennings. And here's the dilemma. Jennings isn't just another depth receiver. He's the type of player who can function as a low-end WR2 if given the opportunity. 9 touchdowns last season in 15 games. That's production. That's reliability. That's red zone presence. But the question isn't about talent. It's about value. Would the Vikings really commit $12–13 million per year to a WR3? That's the range being discussed, and historically, this front office hasn't operated that way. If they were going to spend at that level, they likely would have already committed to someone like Jalen Nailor internally. So, while Jennings is tempting, this feels like a move that only happens if the Vikings decide to aggressively reshape their offensive hierarchy. Because right now, there's already a brewing competition for that WR3 spot. Names like Ty Felton are emerging as early frontrunners, while undrafted options like Dylan Bella could surprise their way onto the roster. This isn't a position lacking bodies. It's a position lacking clarity. And that's what makes the next name on this list so fascinating and controversial. L'Jarius Sneed. 2 years ago, Sneed was one of the most respected lockdown corners in football, a key piece in Kansas City's defensive dominance, a player built for the biggest moments, But today, it's a completely different conversation. Performance has dropped, injuries have taken a toll, and there's a growing sense around the league that his best football might already be behind him. In fact, there's even quiet speculation that retirement could be on the table sooner rather than later. And for Minnesota, this becomes a question of risk versus reality. Do you gamble on a player rediscovering form in a new system? Or do you avoid the situation entirely and invest those resources elsewhere? Based on everything we're seeing, the Vikings are leaning toward caution here. But not every offensive option comes with that level of uncertainty. Because sitting quietly in free agency is a player who, despite inconsistent production, could immediately elevate the depth of this offense. David Njoku. This is one of those moves that doesn't look massive at first glance, until you really think about it. Njoku isn't being brought in to be the star. He's not replacing T.J. Hawkinson. He's not even guaranteed to be TE2. But as a TE3, now you're talking about something different entirely. Even in a down year, 293 yards across 12 games, the underlying value is still there. Athleticism, experience, the ability to create mismatches in certain packages. And when you combine him with Josh Oliver and Hawkinson, suddenly the Vikings have one of the deepest tight end rooms in the league. Not necessarily the most elite, but one of the most versatile. That matters, especially if Minnesota leans more into 12 personnel packages this season, something that's already being hinted at internally. But if you really want to talk about high-risk, high-reward moves, there's one name that stands above the rest: Joey Bosa. At his peak, Bosa is dominant, game-wrecking, the kind of player who forces offenses to change their entire protection scheme. But the reality today? It's complicated. Injuries have chipped away at his consistency. His impact against the run isn't what it used to be. And there are real questions about whether his body can hold up over a full season. Still, if you're the Vikings, you're not asking him to be the centerpiece. You're asking him to be a specialist, a third-down nightmare, a rotational pass rusher, someone who can give you elite snaps in key moments. And at a projected one-year, $10 million type deal, that's a gamble Minnesota might actually consider. And then, there's the trenches. Daquan Jones, one of the best remaining interior defensive linemen available. But here's the twist. This might be the one position the Vikings don't prioritize, because stylistically, Jones overlaps heavily with what they just added in the draft: a run stuffer, a space eater, someone designed to absorb double teams and free up linebackers. So unless Brian Flores wants to fully commit to a heavy rotation on the defensive line, this move feels unlikely. Which brings us to the name that keeps coming up over and over again: inside league circles. The one move that doesn't just make sense, it feels inevitable. DeAndre Hopkins. And here's the part that should get every Vikings fan paying attention. Hopkins himself has already made it clear: if Minnesota calls, he's ready. If the Vikings want me there, I'll be there. That's not speculation. That's direct intent. Now, let's be real. This isn't the same DeAndre Hopkins from his Arizona peak. He's not coming in to be WR1. He's not even your WR2 at this stage. But as a WR3, that's where this becomes dangerous. Because what Hopkins still brings is something you can't teach: route intelligence, body control, and the ability to make contested catches in critical moments. That juice might not translate to elite volume anymore, but in the right role, it translates to impact. And when you pair that with a young receiver like Ty Felton, you're not just adding depth, you're creating balance. The Vikings now have two clear paths in front of them: either lean into heavier formations with multiple tight ends, or bring in a veteran like Hopkins to stabilize the receiver rotation. And right now, all signs are pointing toward Hopkins being that move. Possibly on a one-year deal in the range of $4.5 million, a low-risk investment with potentially high situational value. So, when you step back and look at the full picture, this isn't just about filling roster spots. This is about identity. The Vikings aren't chasing headlines. They're building flexibility. They're preparing for transitions. They're targeting players who fit specific roles inside Brian Flores' system and the evolving offensive structure. And if even half of these moves come together, this roster won't just be deeper. It'll be smarter, more adaptable, more dangerous in ways that don't always show up on paper. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe DeAndre Hopkins is the right move for WR3, or would you go in a completely different direction? And if you're enjoying this kind of deep breakdown, make sure to like the video and subscribe to stay locked in with everything happening around the Minnesota Vikings.